our speaker. Kyle Estes is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Sciences and International Studies at Kartli University. His research and teaching focus on the relationship between ethnic and disruptive politics, national identity, political economy in the post-Soviet region, immigration and refugee studies, and Russian foreign policy. This research is part of a long-term comparative project analyzing ethnic and distributive politics in Kyrgyzstan, Georgia, and Latvia. Dr. Estes will continue conducting research on the topic in spring 2025 as a U.S. Fulbright scholar. He's the recipient of RISC Junior Research Fellowship, supported with a grant from the U.S. Department of Education. Please join me in a round of virtual applause to welcome our speaker, and the floor is yours, Kyle.
Thank you much. Greetings, everybody. I want to just begin by thanking Erisk, and in particular, Diana Lajava and Tellen Lindsay, both for all of their support, logistical support, and otherwise before going into the field and during my time in the field, and also for setting up this talk. I also want to thank, before I start, my local research assistants, without whom this would not have been possible for a variety of reasons, security and otherwise. I will not name all of them right now. So the research I'm going to be presenting today is looking at the determinants of public goods and service distribution in the multi-ethnic Georgian region of Kvemo Kartli, focusing on the roles of ethnic identity, informal networks of access, language capacity, and ethnic kin-state relations. The portion of the research that I'm going to present is based specifically on, and in particular on surveys that I fielded this summer and last, as well as interviews and focus groups, and focuses on Georgian citizens' ability to request public goods and their confidence that these requests will actually be fulfilled by officials and politicians that control public resources. As well as later on in the presentation, the role of Azerbaijan in providing public goods in Kvemo Kartli, which is a pretty interesting new direction that my research is taking. So, as Diana said, this is part of a long-term comparative project looking at Kyrgyzstan, Georgia, and Latvia, and sort of the post-Soviet legacies of ethnic and distributive politics that differ, but also tie these stories of ethnic and distributed politics together. Also, I want to say that because I use statistical techniques that not everyone is going to be familiar with in the presentation, as was said before, if you have any questions during my presentation, just virtually raise your hand, and I'm happy to clarify. Let's go to the next slide. So first, I just want to provide some background on the ethnic politics of the region, that is Kvemo Kartli, which, as you can see, is in Georgia's southeastern border region with Armenia and Azerbaijan. The region is ethnically diverse. Over 40% of the population is represented by Georgia's largest ethnic minority, ethnic Azerbaijanis. This is a Turkic ethnic group that's been compactly settled in the region since being exiled there by Safavid Shah Abbas I in the early 17th century, and Azerbaijanis refer to this historical region as Borchali, and still do to this day. Before saying more about the situation in Kvemo Kartli, I want to place the ethnic politics of Georgia in some historical context. Georgia's minorities policy has been shaped by Soviet legacies and post-Soviet experience in important ways. The creation of titular ethnic groups at the republic level, that is, ethnic Georgians in the Georgian Soviet Socialist Republic, Kyrgyz in the Kyrgyz SSR, and so on and so forth, was an important result of Soviet nationalities policy. From the mid-1920s and until the fall of the Soviet Union, ethnic titular communities, though subordinate in the ethnic hierarchy to Slavs at an all-union level, were granted privileged access to higher education, bureaucratic postings, and party membership in their titular republics. After the fall of the Soviet Union, elites and the broader populace of the titular ethnic group have tended to claim, quote-unquote, ownership of the state and its resources throughout the region. And the post-Soviet experience of ethnic Azerbaijanis in Georgia has been influenced significantly by this context, with discriminatory policies under the early 1990s ethno-nationalist president Zviad Gamsakhuria, followed by a period of state disintegration under Shevardnadze, and eventual progress towards a type of civic nationalist politics in the post-Rose Revolution government. These temporal dynamics were nicely captured by a portion of an interview with an ethnic Azerbaijani South Caucasus political expert who said, quote, "The first years after the fall of the Soviet Union were traumatic and painful for Azerbaijanis. When the Soviet Union collapsed with the democratic wave, the only political mobilizing idea was nationalism. In all the countries of the South Caucasus, this utopic nationalism was prevalent and resulted in conflict, which we still suffer the consequences of. In Georgia, when Gamsakhurdia came to power, he declared, quote, Georgia for Georgians. Some unpleasant things happened in Georgia for Azerbaijanis. Azerbaijanis from Dmanisi and villages in the center of Balnisi were pushed out in different forms. Then in Azerbaijan, Haydar Aliyev came to power, then Shevardnadze came to power. Things stabilized a lot. But the Shevardnadze period was also hard. Nobody was telling the Azerbaijanis, you have to leave Azerbaijan, leave these Georgian lands. But the economic condition, governance, corruption, police, it was very terrible. I remember when I was visiting my family's village in the 1990s, we passed about 100 kilometers from the Azerbaijani border. The roads were in terrible condition, and in every village, you had to get out of the car and pay the police in order to reach your destination. So a lot of Azerbaijanis left Georgia then, to Russia, to Azerbaijan, to Turkey. There was no prosperity or opportunity on the horizon for these people. And during the Gamsakhurdia period, the name of more than 30 villages, including my village, were changed from Azerbaijani to Georgian. Later, neither Shevardnadze nor Saakashvili nor anyone else have changed the names back. Thank God Saakashvili came to power. It was really revolutionary. Things changed dramatically in 1 year. Azerbaijanis could feel that they are part of the country, they're citizens of the country, and they are equal. A lot of things were done. The police brutality and local governance discrimination against Azerbaijanis went away in a very short time, unquote. So this just gives a sense of how things have changed over the 30 or so years since Georgian independence. And so along with their geographic concentration in a border region, Georgian Azerbaijanis have been characterized as a community in between the state and nation building projects of Georgia and Azerbaijan, as reflected in cultural and linguistic characteristics that align with the Azerbaijani state's narrative, along with overwhelmingly civic identification with Georgia as their historical and future homeland. Yet despite this broad identification with Georgia, a longstanding issue faced by the community has been a low level of economic, political, cultural, and linguistic integration, the last of which I will focus on in quite some detail later on. This lack of integration has historically hindered access to higher education and employment opportunities in Georgia, and has also slowed progress in political integration, with disproportionately few Georgian Azerbaijani politicians and administrators and bureaucrats, even at the municipal level, much less the regional level. Even in administrative districts with large proportions of Azerbaijanis, like Gardabani and Marnuli, ethnic Georgians held a majority or plurality of seats, respectively, after the 2017 local elections. As another example, according to a 2017 report by Georgia's Public Defenders Council on Ethnic Minorities, in the municipality of Marnuli, where ethnic Azerbaijanis make up more than 80% of the population, they only made up less than 35% of all of the public administrators in the district. So far less than the proportion they represented in the district. More recently, Kvemo Kartli's governor proudly announced that there were 2 Azerbaijanis working in the regional administration in Rustavi, which should be quite obvious is an incredibly low level of representation for a community that makes up nearly half of the region's population. So all of this is associated with patterns of low levels of political engagement among the community. Research suggests that most Georgian Azerbaijanis do not trust political institutions in Georgia, local or national, and are reluctant to even seek out information about Georgian political processes. So with this background information in mind, let me describe to you the focus of my research, which contributes to a significant and growing literature on the determinants of public goods and service delivery, and engages with the question, why do some citizens have greater capacity to successfully access and demand public resources than others? So to aid in this explanation, I've developed the concept of distributive efficacy, or citizens' ability to access public goods and services, their capacity to request these resources, the relative likelihood that these requests will be fulfilled, and the determinants of all of these factors. So social science research across a range of geographic settings makes clear that different subcategories of citizens vary in their likelihood both to request and to receive public goods and services once they've requested them. And this reflects citizens' varied relationships to politicians and bureaucrats, with politicians being shown to be more likely to respond to constituents from co-ethnic or same race groups across geographic settings. And similarly, bureaucrats may be biased in their apportioning of time depending on who is making a request. This is in part a function of what's called bureaucratic embeddedness, or the basic effects of socialization on the preferences and behavior of civil servants. Bureaucratic bias, just like politicians' biases, has been particularly noticeable across geographic settings towards co-ethnics, people of the same race, people from the same geographic region. And so there are all sorts of explanations for this bureaucratic bias, including outright discrimination, relatively greater abilities of co-ethnics or co-regional members to socially sanction bureaucrats if they fail to sort of show the expected favor or bias. And at the individual level, these inequities in distributive efficacy have also been explained by citizens just becoming over time disillusioned due to previous negative experiences with representatives of the state, and a low perception of external efficacy. That is the extent to which representatives of the state are likely to be responsive to requests. So that means that biased responses from decision makers during initial interactions may lower the likelihood of subsequent attempts by citizens to gain access to public goods and resources. And so in order to explore these issues, I conducted mixed methods field work over the past 2 summers in Tbilisi and in a number of municipalities in Kvemo Kartli, specifically Rustavi, Marneuli, and Gardabani. I chose these cities based on their variation in ethnic demographics. Rustavi is overwhelmingly ethnic Georgian in composition. Marneuli is overwhelmingly ethnic Azerbaijani, and Gardabani is split basically 40% between ethnic Azerbaijanis and ethnic Georgians. So again, for this presentation, I'm going to focus quite a bit on the survey portion of my research. We conducted over 500 survey interviews with adult residents using purposive sampling, and the survey included 2 primary dependent variables evaluating distributive efficacy. The first just measures the extent to which folks felt as though they could successfully request goods. In other words, whether or not they felt they perceived adequate knowledge about who to approach for public goods and services. The second variable measures the extent to which, when a request was made, respondents felt confident that they would actually be successful in receiving the good or service. And then I also created the composite variable distributive efficacy, which was created by just adding the values of the 2 other questions. And so the survey also included questions measuring ethnic identity, informal network size, and Georgian language capacity, as well as just normal demographic questions. And so to understand determinants of distributive efficacy, I use multivariate regression models designed for ordinal variables, specifically logit models. Just for those that are less familiar with multivariate regression, this is an appropriate way to analyze large N data, because it can help us distinguish the explanatory power of independent variables while controlling for key demographic and contextual factors. So quickly, I want to just show some descriptive statistics of demographic variables. We see that we largely sampled from urban areas, but also surveyed a substantial number of respondents from rural areas as well in the second row. Looking at ethnic identity, the overwhelming majority of respondents were either ethnically Georgian or Azerbaijani. We intentionally oversampled ethnic Azerbaijanis in order to have a sufficient sample to analyze this group separately. Going down to gender, our gender balance was almost perfect, actually. And we had quite a bit more respondents over 55 years of age than other age groups. Also, there were very, very few respondents, as you can see in the bottommost row, that were willing to say that they were above average in economic status relative to the community around them. I also should say that across the 2 summers of surveys, the overall response rate was about 67%, so pretty high. It's notable, though, that between last summer and this summer, the response rate fell by about 10%, which may just be chance, but it also may be a reflection of the somewhat, I guess, feverish state of Georgian politics at the moment, and people being somewhat less willing to speak to strangers on the street. So returning then to the first set of questions, existing studies suggest that relying on bottom-up mechanisms for the provision of public resources may widen existing social inequalities because of gaps in perceived ability to request public resources from politicians and bureaucrats, along with biased treatment of subgroups of citizens by these decision makers. So given the underrepresentation of ethnic minorities in the state apparatuses of Kvemo Kartli, I hypothesized first that ethnic Georgians would possess greater confidence in requesting public resources than non-ethnic Georgians. And second, that ethnic Georgians would possess greater confidence that their requests will be fulfilled than non-ethnic Georgians. So looking at multivariate analysis, for all 3 outcome variables, ethnic Georgians do indeed have greater distributive efficacy than non-Georgians. This is particularly the case for the ability to actually, or the perceived ability to request public goods from politicians and other decision makers. In other words, ethnic Georgians, as you can see in the column to the left, are systematically more confident that they know or can find someone to request public resources from as compared to non-Georgians. So this being statistically significant just means that there's a very low likelihood of the relationship being a statistical anomaly. The relationship for the confidence that these requests will actually be fulfilled is not statistically significant, as you can see in the middle column. You can also notice that in the row beneath ethnic Georgian, for response confidence, the more wealthy a respondent is, the more confident they are their requests will be fulfilled, which very well could be a suggestion that more money provides an extra ability to quote unquote grease the wheels of the state, though I don't have any hard evidence that that's what's underlying this relationship. In the column all the way to the right, ethnic Georgians perceive much greater distributive efficacy, and that relationship is statistically significant. So basically, from first glance, we do see certainly some interethnic differences in distributive efficacy between ethnic Georgians and ethnic minorities in Kvemo Kartli. So as with contemporary post-Soviet ethnic politics, the importance of informal networks in contemporary Georgia is in substantial part a Soviet legacy. The persistent Soviet-era shortage of desired goods, combined with the state's pervasive economic role, meant that developing and nurturing networks of access was a prevalent strategy for sustaining material needs. And despite the fall of the Soviet Union and the development of market mechanisms, informality continues to be a definitive aspect of life in much of the post-Soviet region. And indeed, Georgians' informal networks and practices transitioned into post-Soviet settings in the form of a social safety net during the period of widespread socioeconomic insecurity in the 1990s, and have remained significant despite a relative improvement in conditions. Additionally, the form of informal networks of access in the South Caucasus and Georgia is primarily along family and kinship lines, rather than, as in Eastern Europe, founded on weaker ties between friends and acquaintances. So among the major concerns in connection with this persistent informality is the conservation and potential exacerbation of socioeconomic inequalities, as some categories of Georgian residents are likely to have more numerous and qualitatively deeper network ties to those with control over public resources than others. This is particularly relevant in regards to ethnic and distributive politics, and is magnified in a context where informal networks are primarily structured around kinship relations, which are unsurprisingly overwhelmingly monoethnic. So due to the overrepresentation of the ethnic titular group and in turn underrepresentation of ethnic minorities in political and administrative positions in Kvemo Kartli, the continued relevance of informal networks may serve to magnify distributive inequity across ethnic lines, with minority communities left with few direct or indirect routes to access state resources, as is evident in other settings with similar Soviet institutional legacies that I've studied in, such as Kyrgyzstan. So the previous two hypotheses then assume that citizens interact with the state as individuals, but due to the continued significance of informal networks in the region and in Georgia, we would expect that citizens would be able to leverage these connections to influence the distribution of resources for public resources in their local area. Additionally, it's also likely that there's an interethnic distinction in the role of informal connections on distributive efficacy. Again, this is founded on two considerations. First, social networks, regardless of what geographic setting we're talking about, tend to be overwhelmingly ethnically homogenous. There are, of course, exceptions to that, but overwhelmingly, social networks tend to be ethnically homogenous. And second, considering that the state administration in Kvemo Kartli is predominantly ethnic Georgian, and informal networks of access in Georgia are largely structured along lines of kinship, we would expect that informal connections would be particularly beneficial to Georgians' co-ethnic distributive efficacy relative to ethnic minorities in the region. So the way in which we measured informal networks is through a few different kinds of survey items. First, we asked respondents in 4 different survey questions approximately how many times in the past month they had given or received either monetary or non-monetary assistance to friends, family, or acquaintances. These responses were then just added up to serve as a measure of retrospective informal networks of reciprocity. And second, just recognizing that the past month might have been a strange or abnormal month for respondents. We also asked 2 prospective or hypothetical questions about informal networks or informal connections, one for monetary and one for non-monetary informal connections, as you can see on the slide. And so given the strong positive correlation of the retrospective and prospective variables, I've combined them to create a composite variable of informal network connectedness, and this captures the different aspects of informal connectedness that they represent. So analyzing hypothesis 3, which just proposes that regardless of ethnic background, having larger informal networks will provide greater access to public goods and services. We do indeed find that, yes, having more informal connections is associated with a much greater sense of distributive efficacy, and in particular for the ability to request public goods and services. So again, there's no statistically significant predictive relationship between having more informal connections and actually having confidence that your requests will be fulfilled by agents of the state. But there is significant evidence that those with more informal connections are going to have more confidence that they can actually request public goods, and also that they have more distributive efficacy overall in the right side column. So this provides support then for the idea that indeed distributive politics in Kvemo Kartli is still structured substantially by informal networks of access. And then to explore inter-ethnic differentials and test hypothesis 4, rather than the standard survey approach, I included a list experiment designed to measure the extent of the use of informal connections to access public resources. So this list experiment approach, for those that are not familiar, is useful when studying behaviors that respondents might be hesitant to provide truthful responses about to perceived social undesirability. So for instance, this could be used and has been used in studies regarding sensitive political views in highly polarized or authoritarian settings, or deviant behavior such as the use of narcotics or engaging in bribery or other forms of low-level corruption. So how was this structured in my case? So during the course of the survey, a randomly selected control group of respondents were provided the list of 4 neutral and straightforward checklist items about governance, and were asked to indicate how many of the items they agree with. They were instructed to not identify which specific items they agreed with. That's an important part of the survey list method. And then the randomly selected treatment group was provided these items, these 4 items, and an additional item that asks about respondents' perceptions of being able to use social connections to access public goods and services, as you can see. And given the random selection into control and treatment groups, and a simple difference in means test comparing item responses provides estimate of the frequency with which the behavior or opinion indicated in the treatment occurs in the population of interest, in this case, in these 3 cities in Kvemo Kartli. So here are the results from the list experiment. Looking from left to right in the second column, we can see that from a simple difference in means analysis, comparing the control and treatment groups, we can estimate that approximately 48% of Kvemo Kartli residents in the cities sampled feel that they can use informal connections to influence the distribution of public resources. And looking at the next column to the right, for ethnic Georgians, the difference in means test suggests that nearly 3 in 4 ethnic Georgians in the region perceive an ability to use informal connections to influence state distribution of resources. Lastly, among the non-Georgian subsample, which is overwhelmingly ethnic Azerbaijani, as we saw, only 36%, well, only, that depends on what you think is a normal level of informality, but compared to the ethnic Georgian subsample, only 36% perceive this ability to use informal connections to access state resources. And so for each subgroup, the differences between the control and treatment groups are highly statistically significant, as is the difference when comparing the ethnic Georgian and non-Georgian subgroups. These results then reflect the predominance of ethnic Georgians in state structures, and in turn, that non-ethnic Georgians have relatively less capacity to informally influence the distribution of public resources in Kvemo Kartli. So we've now seen some evidence that there are systematic differences in distributive efficacy between ethnic Georgians and others in Kvemo Kartli, but we want to understand the causes of these disparities. As described, one cause is just the lower prevalence among non-Georgians of access to useful informal networks that are integrated into public resource distribution chains in the region. But distributive efficacy might also be influenced by other capacities or social tools as well. As I mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, while the ethnic Azerbaijani minority maintains broad identification with Georgia as its current and future homeland, a longstanding issue faced by the community has been lack of familiarity and command of the Georgian language. Though the Saakashvili administration developed a language-centered civic nationalism which emphasized increasing Georgian language capacities among concentrated minorities, according to the 2014 census, less than 20% of ethnic Azerbaijanis across Georgia were fluent in Georgian, and in Kvemo Kartli, just above 10% of ethnic Azerbaijanis were fluent in Georgian. So very little improvement from the 2002 census, even though, again, language integration was and still is, at least on paper, a priority of the government. So among the implications of this language gap for Georgian Azerbaijanis has been cultural, civic, and social isolation from the rest of Georgian society and the Georgian state, and sustained material and cultural attachment to their ethnic kin state, Azerbaijan. There have been important reforms, including the expansion of bilingual education in ethnic minority schools, and the 1+4 program in higher education, where ethnic minority university students can take 1 year of Georgian language courses prior to beginning their first sort of official year in university. Despite that, the language issue has still makes access to higher education and employment, especially in the public sector, a struggle, and is often referenced by ethnic Azerbaijanis and others as a motivator for external labor migration. Additionally, we can also imagine how language capacity or the lack thereof could influence distributive efficacy. Remembering that even in areas of extensive ethnic minority concentration like Marnuli, there are relatively few ethnic minority political representatives or bureaucrats, and assuming, as we might, and as is the fact, that the vast majority of ethnic Georgian local politicians do not speak ethnic minority languages, it's likely that individuals without Georgian language capacity would face a significant challenges of making claims on state resources. Moreover, while by law in areas of ethnic minority concentration, there should be the same information distributed regarding the proper means of engaging with state institutions in Georgian and ethnic minority languages, according to most respondents, this is simply not the case. In fact, most reported there are almost no public resources expended on increasing knowledge of how to engage with state institutions in the native languages of concentrated ethnic minorities. So the difficulty in making direct requests to overwhelmingly ethnic Georgian representatives of the state and the lack of resources to increase this particular aspect of civic literacy among non-Georgian speaking segments of the population would lead us very directly to believe that comparing only among non-ethnic Georgians, those with greater fluency in the state language would have a higher level of distributive efficacy. So in order to measure my respondents' capacity in the Georgian language, I asked 2 questions. One, just how frequently do they speak Georgian? And another, how proficient they are in speaking Georgian. And I've just combined these 2 together because they correlate highly, but also reflect somewhat different aspects of Georgian language capacity to create a language capacity variable, which is the main explanatory variable for these coming models. So unsurprisingly, among non-ethnic Georgians in Kvemo Kartli, having greater capacity in the Georgian language is very significantly and positively predictive of a greater sense that they are able to request public goods from the state. Somewhat surprisingly, and as I'll talk about more in a second, somewhat hopefully, having greater Georgian language capacity is not in any statistically significant way predictive of actual confidence that requests will be fulfilled by representatives of the state. So this might suggest that, well, representatives of the state aren't outright discriminatory towards members of ethnic minority groups. But for the composite distributive efficacy variable, indeed, we do see that higher Georgian language capacity is predictive of overall higher distributive efficacy, more ability to make claims on the state and successfully make claims on the state. So these results then provide pretty strong evidence that non-ethnic Georgians in Kvemo Kartli with greater capacity in the state language perceive greater influence on the distribution of public resources in the region. So before moving on to talk about the role of Azerbaijan as an ethnic kin state, I want to just sort of summarize what I've talked about here. What these results strongly suggest is that the capacity to request and successfully receive public resources, what I've called distributive efficacy, is structured by these Soviet legacies of ethnic politics, specifically the underrepresentation of ethnic minorities in political and administrative positions, and the continued importance of informal networks of access. So the first key finding to note is that ethnic Georgians in Kvemo Kartli perceive themselves to have a higher level of distributive efficacy than non-Georgians, thus having greater sway over the flow of public resources in the region. It's also notable, though, that this distinction is much greater in regards to what's called internal efficacy, that is, the extent to which individuals feel capable of making a request for public goods or services, than for external efficacy, or the likelihood that these requests will be actually granted or fulfilled. So again, on the one hand, this paints a somewhat hopeful picture, right? It suggests that the representatives of the state in Kvemo Kartli are possibly not actively discriminatory towards ethnic minorities, and this could lead us to believe that if ethnic minorities develop the civic, first of all, but also linguistic tools to capably make requests of the government, interethnic differences in internal distributive efficacy might slowly fade away. Yet this optimism is tempered by the reality that distributive politics in Kvemo Kartli is structured in a significant way by informal networks of access. Those residents of the region with more informal connections perceive themselves to have greater distributive efficacy, in particular to be more capable of requesting public resources. I also find, though, that ethnic Georgians are substantially more confident in their ability to use informal connections to access public resources than ethnic minorities. And as I mentioned, this very likely rests on two foundations. First, the dominance of state institutions, even in multi-ethnic Kvemo Kartli by ethnic Georgians. And second, the fact that informal networks of access in Georgia are largely structured around kinship networks, which are overwhelmingly ethnically homogeneous. Taking these two conditions together, then, we can imagine that even if all ethnic Azerbaijanis in Kvemo Kartli were to develop Georgian language fluency in the coming years, the importance of informal networks means that without an increase in state representation of ethnic minorities in the region, a gap in distributive efficacy would likely remain, and also likely a large gap would remain. Further, though, and in line with expectations, I find that non-ethnic Georgians' distributive efficacy, in particular, again, their capacity to request public resources, is strongly dependent on their Georgian language capacity. So this means that provision of one crucial public good, that is adequate instruction in the state language, is to a significant degree a prerequisite for equitable distribution of other public goods. And the significant role of Georgian language capacity in differentiating the ability to request public resources among non-ethnic Georgians is explained by, again, first, the lack of minority language knowledge among most ethnic Georgians, including politicians and administrators in the region. And second, the decreasing knowledge among Georgian citizens, regardless of ethnicity, of Russian, which long served as the language of interethnic communication. So this suggests that, barring the reemergence of Russian language proficiency or the popularization of another bridging language like English, the most plausible path towards reducing inequities in the demand element of distributive efficacy is to increase Georgian language capacity among ethnic minority communities. But as I've said already, this linguistic integration is progressing very, very slowly. Further research then should focus on the reason for this lack of progress in language integration. So first off, it might be that members of the ethnic minority communities in Georgia simply aren't interested in learning the state language, either due to long-term ties to their kin states with some imagined potential of quote-unquote return, or a lack of faith that their investment in language would actually be rewarded by full social, civic, and economic inclusion. Alternatively, and there's certainly some evidence for this. It could be that the quality and quantity of the state programs to increase Georgian language knowledge is insufficient or poorly structured. Again, those are questions that should be looked at more deeply in future research. With all that said, now I'd like to shift now to another focus of my research. Ethnic kin state provision of public resources, where in this case, Azerbaijan, it's the ethnic kin state of ethnic Azerbaijanis in Georgia. As I've looked over this topic over the past few summers, it's become increasingly clear that Azerbaijan and its state-affiliated corporations, in particular SOCAR, the state oil and gas company of Azerbaijan, play an important and significant role in Kvemo Kartli, seeing it as their responsibility to provide for their compatriots, by which they mean ethnic Azerbaijani citizens of Georgia. So before providing some background on the foundations and development of Georgia-Azerbaijan bilateral relations and discussing the specific forms of public goods that Azerbaijan provides, let me describe a bit of the literature on ethnic kin-state relations. So as Brubaker describes in a landmark 1995 article, the breakup in the late 20th century of multinational states like the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia led to a multitude of what he called triadic nexuses, made up of national minorities, in our case, ethnic Azerbaijanis in Georgia, nationalizing states like post-independence Georgia, and external homelands or kin states like Azerbaijan. And to make clear, the notion of external quote-unquote homelands does not necessarily mean that members of the co-ethnic community abroad or their ancestors once lived in ethnic kin state territory, and the external co-ethnic community might not even overwhelmingly perceive the kin state as their homeland. Instead, the conceptualization of the external homeland is largely constructed by the elites in the homeland state or the kin state, who conceive of co-ethnics abroad as part of the same national family and thus is deserving of special care for their interests. Yet, of course, claiming that homeland states or kin states perceive some responsibility to monitor and affect the circumstances of their co-ethnics abroad allows for a variety of forms and intensities of support, from supportive rhetoric to material support, including infrastructure development, providing educational resources, all the way to automatic citizenship in the kin state for co-ethnics abroad, and beyond that, irredentism, that is, trying to take the territory or take over the territory that co-ethnics live in abroad, see Ukraine, for instance. So what determines the quality and extent of kin-state relations towards co-ethnic kin abroad? There are two primary approaches to answering this question. The first assumes that ethnic identity and co-ethnic identity overrides all rational strategy on the part of ethnic kin states, homeland states, and co-ethnic kin abroad. So there's then, in this set of the literature, some sense that homeland engagement with co-ethnics abroad is destabilizing and conflict producing in all cases, and it's just seen as a step towards irredentism. But these assumptions make the mistake of confusing rhetoric that favors co-ethnics abroad with plans for actual material action, when in fact the rhetoric that ethnic kin states use is often aimed at not co-ethnic kin abroad, but actually constituents at home in the kin state itself. So in our case, political factions, citizens of Azerbaijan itself. So rather than being determined by uncontrollable co-ethnic affections, kin state actions towards co-ethnics abroad are constrained by basic political factors. The availability of scarce resources to engage in multiple arenas, competition among domestic political factions, the relative importance of different foreign policy priorities, and the alignment or discrepancy in interest between the homeland or kin state and host state in other important policy arenas like economics and security. It's also notable that the presence of sizable or even relatively small concentrated minorities in kin state border areas, in this case, ethnic Georgians in Azerbaijan, may be a constraint on ethnic kin-state policy towards their co-ethnics abroad, because too much mobilizational activity may be feared to be seen as basically an invitation for reciprocal action on the part of the host state. As the case of Azerbaijan's engagement with Georgian and Azerbaijanis will suggest, the notion that ethnic affinity will determine actions towards co-ethnics abroad is too simplistic. Instead, the domestic and foreign policy strategies of both kin states and host countries may harmonize in such a way that kin-state engagement can be perceived as mutually stabilizing. As Melvin and King make clear, quote, states that take an interest in the fate of co-ethnics abroad are not necessarily future aggressors. States attempt to reach out to co-ethnic communities for a variety of reasons, many of which have more to do with domestic politics in the kin state than with foreign policy. Host states, again, Georgia in our context, may actually welcome the kin state's interest, touting the diaspora as an important cultural link or even an economic resource binding the kin state and the host state together, unquote. In other words, then, the kin state engagement may actually work against irredentism by moderating minority demands in the host state, making sure co-ethnics abroad are satisfied with life in their host state, such that calls for irredentism both among co-ethnics abroad and kin-state political factions are minimized. So in order to better understand the constraints on Azerbaijani policy towards co-ethnics in Georgia, useful to understand the present and past bilateral relations of the two states. The strong strategic alliance that exists today was established in significant part on the personal relationship between the two former Soviet and then post-Soviet leaders, Heydar Aliyev and Edward Shevardnadze in the 1990s. This bilateral relationship continued to flourish after the Rose Revolution, also on the basis of personal ties between the current Aliyev and Saakashvili, and remains stable today, though most experts say the personal relationship aren't quite as well developed as in the past. Beyond personal relations, though, what is the mutually beneficial relationship built on? Economically, Georgia provides a transit route to the Black Sea and onto Europe for Azerbaijani gas, as well as the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan oil pipeline. Reciprocally, Azerbaijan stepped in as the replacement supplier of natural gas following the 2008 Russo-Georgian War and remains the dominant supplier to this day, though Russia is beginning to supply more and more gas every year to Georgia. Moreover, Azerbaijan is consistently among the largest sources of foreign investment in Georgia. Politically, the two states since independence have tended to hold harmonious foreign policy interests, particularly in regard to their primary external opponents, Armenia and Russia, respectively. As an example, while Georgia clearly gained energy security through replacing Russian supplies of natural gas with Azerbaijani sources, this was also an opportunity for Azerbaijan to score a geopolitical victory against Russia, which until recent years had been Armenia's primary security guarantor. Further, the shared experience of territorial insecurity in Nagorno-Karabakh and South Ossetia and Abkhazia has led to mutual support for the other's territorial integrity, with Azerbaijan consistently voicing its position in international forums that South Ossetia and Abkhazia are Georgian territories, and Georgia consistently recognizing Nagorno-Karabakh as Azerbaijani. Moreover, the mutual recognition of territorial integrity exists despite the potential for irredentism on both sides, with each state having concentrated ethnic kin on the other side of the border. While officials of each state maintain that there are no pretensions to cross-border territorial claims, popular opinion from time to time brings the question to the surface. This occurred in 2015, for instance, when a football match in Tbilisi between Azerbaijani and Georgian clubs erupted in scandal, with Georgian fans hanging banners laying claims to the Azerbaijani regions of Zaqatala and Kahi, which were apportioned to the Azerbaijani SSR by Soviet authorities in 1921, and which contain concentrated ethnic Georgian minorities. At a following match in Baku, Azerbaijani fans hung in return a banner stating that the former Azerbaijani language names of predominantly Azerbaijani towns in Georgia should be returned, as well as, unsurprisingly, a map of Greater Azerbaijan that included the Borchali region, now part of Kvemo Kartli. You can see here in the pictures the banner that was draped in 2015, and also a banner that was draped in 2014 in Azerbaijan by Georgian fans that were visiting that showed a map of Greater Georgia. As a sign of both states' official value of this strategic relationship, immediately after these events, Georgian officials up to the prime minister stressed that the strategic relationship was ongoing and shouldn't be threatened by what they called hooliganism by their fans. So understanding the background of the strategic relationship between the two states, we're better positioned to understand Azerbaijan's provision of public resources in Kvemo Kartli. Unfortunately, there's no unified database with all of the public goods and services rendered to the region from Azerbaijan and state-owned companies. Yet from the evidence that I've collected from interviews, expert analysis, and news reports, a few things become clear. First, although agreements between Azerbaijan and Kvemo Kartli officials, like the landmark 2012 Memorandum of Understanding, frame the assistance as directed towards the Kvemo Kartli region as a whole, in practice, the resources are overwhelmingly directed towards individual ethnic Azerbaijanis and areas of the region that ethnic Azerbaijanis are concentrated in. Secondly, Azerbaijan provides a diverse variety of goods and services in the region, including sports complexes in Azerbaijani villages, aid in renovating Azerbaijani language public schools, provision of textbooks and language materials, food assistance during the COVID crisis to hundreds of residents, and all the way up to providing piped water in ethnic Azerbaijani villages. Perhaps, though, most reflective of Azerbaijan's goals of maintaining political and economic stability in Kvemo Kartli is the efforts made toward integration of the Azerbaijani community into Georgian society. This is evidenced by significant investment in Georgian language integration programs, as well as providing scholarships for ethnic Azerbaijani students to study in Georgian universities in the Georgian language. To show the scope of these efforts, in 2020, the head of SOCAR Georgia, Mahir Mamadov, announced that almost 2,000 of the approximately 3,000 ethnic Azerbaijanis studying in Georgian universities were receiving grants from SOCAR, the state oil company. So about 2/3 of ethnic Azerbaijanis in Georgian universities at that time were receiving scholarships from the Azerbaijani government, if under a different name. So what motivates both sides of this relationship to engage in this kin-state public goods provision? From discussions with regional experts and analysis of policy papers, for Azerbaijan's part, it seems that this is an element of maintaining a relatively content, pacified, and importantly loyal co-ethnic community in Kvemo Kartli. Moreover, the focus on linguistic integration of ethnic Azerbaijanis is directed towards producing a skilled, highly educated, highly positioned cohort of potential lobbyists for Azerbaijani state interests in Georgia. But why does Georgia agree to this arrangement, given that it means a continued linkage of loyalty between the Azerbaijani state and Azerbaijani co-ethnics in Kvemo Kartli? Evidence suggests that this is basically a second best strategy founded on the relatively sparse resources controlled by the Georgian state. While it might prefer to engage in comprehensive top-down integration of ethnic Azerbaijanis and other ethnic minorities that would engender complete loyalty to the Georgian nation state, such civic nation building is costly and time-consuming. So instead, entrusting a core state function, that is the provision of public goods and services, to a strategic partner that has overlapping interests allows Georgia and its governments to spread resources to other areas. So since we now have some understanding of the scope and purpose of Azerbaijani public goods provision and how it's structured by ethnic and state relations, let's look at how residents of the region perceive of this issue. In particular, do they support the role of Azerbaijan, providing public resources to the region? How is this conditioned by ethnic identity? And how is this conditioned by the information that, in fact, most of these resources go to areas of ethnic Azerbaijani concentration? So in order to explore these questions, I included in this year's Wave of the Survey an experimental item where a randomly selected half of respondents were simply asked, basically, do you support or oppose the Azerbaijani government providing various public resources to the region? And then another randomly selected half of respondents were also provided the information that, in fact, most of these resources go to ethnic Azerbaijani areas of concentration. So given assumptions about co-ethnic affinity and attitudes towards co-ethnic kin states, I propose the following hypotheses about public attitudes towards Azerbaijani provision of public goods. First, just simply that ethnic Azerbaijanis will be more supportive of Azerbaijan providing public resources than non-ethnic Azerbaijanis. And second, once folks are informed that public goods and resources primarily target ethnic Azerbaijani communities, that this will lead to an increase in ethnic Azerbaijani support and a decrease among the non-ethnic Azerbaijani subsample. So since I don't have any expectations about the full sample at all, I'm just going to skip that first column to the left. But actually, let's just look across the rows, looking at the second to top row for the control group. So comparing relative support among ethnic Azerbaijanis and non-Azerbaijanis, in both the control and treatment groups, Azerbaijanis are more supportive of Azerbaijan's role in providing resources in Kvemo Kartli. In neither case, though, is this difference statistically significant. So maybe if I had 1,000 responses, we'd find some statistical significance, but we have no firm evidence that there's a real difference here in between Azerbaijanis and non-Azerbaijanis. Looking at hypothesis 7A, I actually find that support falls, looking at the second column to the right. Support falls among Azerbaijanis when it's mentioned that resources primarily target ethnic Azerbaijani communities. But again, this difference is not statistically significant. Then looking at the non-Azerbaijani subsample, I do find indeed, when targeting of ethnic Azerbaijani communities is mentioned, support falls. But again, this is not statistically significant. In short, then, there's not any clear evidence that, first of all, ethnic Azerbaijanis are more supportive of kin state supply of public goods and services in the region. And when respondents are informed that these resources primarily target ethnic Azerbaijani communities, there's not significant evidence that this increases Azerbaijani support or decreases support among ethnic Azerbaijani subgroups. So maybe people don't actually think about this that much. Maybe for ethnic Azerbaijanis, they already assume that, well, of course, Azerbaijan is going to provide resources mostly to ethnic Azerbaijani regions. Or again, maybe it's a function of simply not having enough responses to reach statistical significance. Any suggestions on what it might be would be helpful. So my next steps in this project involve expanding the scope to a comparative context within Georgia with a similar analysis of the region of Jabaheti, where ethnic Armenians constitute a concentrated minority. And I'm going to conduct this research in spring 2025 over about 5 months of fieldwork. And so the greater part of my time will be spent in and around the same cities in Kvemo Kartli as well as the cities of Akhaltsikhe, Akhalkalaki, and Barjomi in Javakheti. These are fitting comparison cases, as you can see in the table here. They have demographic variety, and this demographic variety should be reflected in local politics, both in terms of ethnic representation in local political administrations, as well as popular expectations and understandings of the distribution of public resources. And so just comparing across these regions, Kvemo Kartli and Javakheti exhibit similar ethnic demography, both contain large proportions of ethnic minorities, with the other largest group in each region being ethnic Georgians. But there are significant cultural and political differences between the two geographically concentrated groups in the regions. The ethnic Armenian community of Javakheti is primarily Armenian Orthodox, a Christian denomination, while the ethnic Azerbaijani community is primarily Muslim. And this is relevant to the extent that non-Christians in Georgia, primarily Muslims in this context, often perceive interfaith relations as discriminatory due to Georgian ethno-religious nationalism. Moreover, the patterns of ethnic minority representation are notably different between the two regions. Based on my own discussions and other people's research, a majority of the political institutions of majority minority cities in Javakheti are completely dominated by ethnic Armenians, whereas in Kvemo Kartli, even in areas where ethnic Azerbaijanis are a significant majority, there's a much greater balance in ethnic representation among ethnic Georgians and ethnic Azerbaijanis. So there should be some interesting differences between these two regions based on that. So thank you very much for your attention, and I appreciate any comments or questions.